So right before we jump in, I just want to give a quick welcome to everyone tuning in to this Dark Souls special edition podcast brought to you by Haunted Podcast with hosts Gary and Emily.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and make sure you like and subscribe to the Haunted Podcast for more incredible content. But to get us started today, I want you to imagine something.
Okay, I'm with you.
Imagine you are the CEO of like the most successful revolutionary startup in the history of the world. You've just overthrown this massive ancient monopoly. You've built a literal golden city.
Right, total market dominance.
Exactly. You've established a whole system of government, art, culture that spans continents, and your primary energy source seems completely infinite. So it's this absolute golden age.
Sounds pretty ideal.
It does. But then, decades in, you look at the master gauge, and you realize, with creeping horror, that you are actually running out of fuel. The lights are going to go out.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, the whole system is going to collapse. And whatever comes next is entirely unknown. So my question to you is, what lines would you cross to keep those lights on? Who would you sacrifice to maintain the world you built? Welcome to today's deep dive.
Man, that is the ultimate question, isn't it? It's that classic struggle of self-preservation versus, natural progression. And it is basically the defining question of the historical timeline we are examining today.
It really is, because usually when we do a historical study on this show, we're looking at things like the Roman Empire, right?
Yeah.
Or the Han Dynasty, or the Industrial Revolution.
Right, sifting through ruined aqueducts or translating faded parchment, that sort of thing.
Exactly. But today we are taking that exact same rigorous historical lens and applying it to a completely different kind of universe. The famously brutal, enigmatic, and just deeply tragic world of Dark Souls.
Which is such a fascinating approach to take.
It is. We are treating this entirely as a literal historical study. We're going to examine the rise, the reign, and the catastrophic fall of a ruler named Gwyn, the Lord of Sunlight, and we're going to trace the subsequent ages that his decisions spawned.
And I think it's a really necessary approach, too, because if you just look at the surface of this timeline, you just see monsters and knights,
Well,
right?
just typical fantasy stuff.
Right. But if you look at the actual architecture of the events, you're looking at a historical timeline built on the ashes of an entire world. Mm-hmm. It's really a masterclass in the dangers of artificial preservation.
Definitely. So today, we're going to explore how a single ruler's paralyzing fear of the dark led to a world-breaking cycle of human sacrifice.
And we're going to examine the actual scientific concepts of entropy and alchemy to understand how this world functioned.
Yeah, we'll dive deep into the philosophical frameworks of utilitarianism and existentialism, because this is a story of empires rising and falling and the underlying physics of reality breaking down.
All leading to the ultimate, horrifying price of manufacturing an artificial eternity.
So, where do we start?
Well, to truly grasp the magnitude of what Gwyn broke, we can't start at the end. We actually have to bring you back to the very dawn of this historical timeline.
Okay, set the scene for us.
We have to look at the end of what is known as the Age of Ancients and the violent birth of the Age of Fire. Because before we can analyze how Gwyn destroyed the world, we have to understand exactly how he built it.
Right, let's unpack this. So the records describe this primordial era, the Age of Ancients, as this period of static gray. The world was dominated by crags, arch trees, and ruled by a species known as the everlasting dragons.
Yes.
And the key phrase that appears to describe this era is that there was, quote, no disparity. What does that actually mean in a practical sense?
Well, when the texts say no disparity, they mean it in a really profound, almost thermodynamic sense.
Okay, thermodynamics, how so?
Before the advent of the first flame, the world completely lacked the fundamental tensions that make change possible. And without change, you can't have time, and you certainly cannot have history.
That makes sense. I mean, in our universe, everything is driven by the transfer of energy, right?
Exactly. Hot moving to cold, high pressure moving to low pressure. But in the Age of Ancients, there was literally no heat and no cold. There was no life and no death. No light and no dark.
Just a flat line.
Yeah, it was a perfectly neutral, unchanging, eternal equilibrium.
So it wasn't just like a boring time period. The laws of physics, as we understand them, literally did not exist yet.
Precisely. And the everlasting dragons, they weren't just large apex predators. They were mineral representations of this stagnation.
Mineral, like made of rock.
Basically, yeah. They were covered in scales of immortal stone. And they were immortal because the very concept of mortality, the concept of degradation and decay, it just didn't exist in their reality yet.
Wow.
They weren't living creatures surviving. They simply were. They existed in the exact same way a rock exists.
But then, the inciting incident of this entire universe happens. Deep underground, the first flame spontaneously appears.
Out of nowhere.
Right, out of nowhere. And with it, disparity is born. Suddenly, the world is defined by opposites: heat and cold, life and death. And from within this flame, humanoid beings find what are known as Lord Souls.
Which are these concentrations of immense reality-defining power.
Exactly. And Gwyn claims the most powerful of these, the soul of light. And what I find absolutely incredible is his innovative, almost scientific use of it. The texts note that he literally bent light to create lightning.
What's really fascinating here is the sheer tactical brilliance of that innovation.
Right.
Yeah, because the everlasting dragons were impervious to physical harm because they were stone. They had zero biological vulnerabilities.
Swords and spears wouldn't do anything.
Exactly. But by wielding a Lord Soul to manipulate light into a focused, highly energetic and destructive force lightning, Gwyn introduced a completely new physical property to the ecosystem.
He didn't just hit them with a big stick. He introduced the concept of thermodynamics to a species that had never experienced it.
Exactly. He weaponized disparity. The lightning acted as intense, localized heat and friction, which shattered the dragon's stone scales.
Oh, that is brilliant.
And by peeling away that stone, Gwyn introduced vulnerability, and consequently, he introduced the concept of mortality to an immortal species. He literally forced the laws of physics onto them, and the laws of physics killed them.
It wasn't just a battle for territory then. It was a fundamental altering of the ecosystem.
Absolutely.
Gwyn leads this massive crusade against the dragons, and you get the sense that it wasn't just for survival. Once he realized he could kill them, it became this display of ultimate dominance.
Oh, for sure.
Like, if you look at the architecture of his eventual capital city and Orlando, it is adorned with dragon skulls. They're hung up like trophies in a hunting lodge. He hunted the former rulers of reality for sport.
Which speaks volumes about the culture of the early age of fire, doesn't it? It was a culture defined by triumph, by absolute dominance over the old world order.
Yeah, total victory.
Gwyn didn't just defeat the old world. He mounted its head on his wall as a testament to his own superiority. But as we see throughout human history, conquering a world is a very different skill set from governing one.
Which brings us to how he actually structured his new empire.
Yeah.
So, to cement his rule, Gwyn establishes an elite military guard, the Four Knights.
Right, you have Ornstein the Dragon Slayer, Artorias the Abyss Walker, Goth the Archer, and Siren the Assassin.
Yeah, they were the tip of the spear, securing his borders and enforcing his will. But Gwyn was also a master of political maneuvering. He didn't just rule by brute force.
No, he recognized the need for strategic alliances to maintain a vast civilization.
Right, he worked with the Pygmies, who were the ancestors of humanity. He actually made peace with a few remaining dragons who defected to his side.
Yes.
And most crucially, he shared fragments of his own Lord Soul with key allies. He gave a piece to a traitorous dragon named Seath the Scaleless, and he gave a piece to the human rulers of a city called New Lundo, known as the Four Kings.
Right.
Now, wait, I want to push back on this a little bit.
Okay, go ahead.
I read this, and I instantly think of that modern startup founder analogy we talked about. Imagine Gwyn as a visionary who successfully disrupts an entire industry, the everlasting dragons.
Right. The ultimate disruption.
He has this massive initial success. The Age of Fire is booming. But then he scales too fast. To maintain control over this rapidly expanding, unwieldy empire, he starts handing out equity fragments of his own literal soul to regional managers and board members to keep them happy.
I see where you're going with this.
Like, he thinks he is buying loyalty, but isn't he essentially just paying bribes? Isn't he unknowingly distributing the very capital that will be used to set up power struggles and eventually dismantle his kingdom?
You know, that is an excellent way to frame it, and it really gets to the heart of the political tension of the era. It's easy to view it as a desperate bribe with the benefit of hindsight, sure.
But at the time.
At the time, consider the geopolitics of the early Age of Fire. Gwyn was attempting to unite incredibly disparate species, gods, humans, giants, and even dragons, under a single banner.
That's no small task.
Not at all. By granting fragments of his soul to Seath and the Four Kings, he was elevating them to a semi-divine status. He was intertwining their authority with his own. If they rebelled, they would be rebelling against the very source of their power.
Ah, so it was a form of mutually assured destruction, politically speaking.
Precisely. And it highlights a crucial historical point. Gwyn was not a cartoonish one-dimensional tyrant. He really fits the archetype of the wise king found in many ancient civilizations.
He was a builder.
He was a diplomat, a delegator, and someone who genuinely tried to foster a prosperous age. He built grand cities like Anorlunda, complete with massive cathedrals, complex social hierarchies, vibrant cultures.
He tried to create lasting stability in a universe that had just been violently birthed into existence.
He really did. The early Age of Fire, by all accounts, was considered a true golden era of prosperity and advancement.
And I think that is exactly what makes his eventual downfall so compelling. It's akin to a classic Greek tragedy, right?
I believe.
His failure wasn't born of malice or cruelty, but of hubris and a fundamental inability to accept the natural limitations of the system he had built. He gave away so much of his intrinsic power to maintain the structure of his kingdom that when the foundation inevitably started to crumble, he lacked the singular strength to hold it together.
And we see that transition in history all the time. The peak of an empire is often the exact moment its decline begins.
Gwyn conquered the dragons by weaponizing disparity, by introducing change. But the tragic irony is that once he built his perfect golden age, he became absolutely terrified of change.
Right.
And that introduces a fatal flaw into his empire's architecture. Because you cannot build a permanent static kingdom using a power source that is fundamentally designed to burn out.
Exactly. And to understand why the fading of the first flame was such an existential crisis, we have to view it through the scientific lens of entropy.
Okay, let's get into the science of it.
The second law of thermodynamics dictates that in a closed system, order inevitably moves toward disorder. Energy disperses. Heat dissipates.
So nothing lasts forever.
Right. Just as our own sun will eventually consume its nuclear fuel and die, Gwyn's Age of Fire was naturally physically meant to end. The flame was a finite resource, it was a chemical reaction, and it was simply running out of combustible material.
But Gwyn just could not accept that. He had this paralyzing fear of what came after the fire. He was terrified of the dark.
He was.
And what I found so illuminating in this study is that his fear wasn't just, a mundane fear of the lights going out. He wasn't just worried about economic collapse or losing political power.
No, it was vastly more dangerous than that. If we connect this to the broader cosmological picture, we can frame the dark in this history using the concepts of medieval alchemy.
Alchemy, okay.
Yeah, in alchemy, there is a foundational idea of the primum materia. It's the chaotic, formless, primordial substance from which all organized matter is shaped. It's basically the raw clay of reality before it is baked in the kiln.
I see what you did there.
Indeed. So in this historical context, the dark wasn't simply an absence of photons. It wasn't just a shadow. It was an active, mutating physical force.
So it was tangible.
Very tangible. When the first flame began to fade, the boundaries of reality started to soften. The dark, often manifesting as a physical corruption known as the abyss, began to actually seep into the world.
And what did that do?
Well, the abyss didn't just kill things, it unmade them. It took organized biological life and mutated it into twisted, chaotic creatures. It induced madness. The dark was the literal unmaking of the ordered, rational world Gwyn had constructed.
Wow. So imagine the psychological state of a ruler in this position. You are watching your world literally run out of energy. You know the physics are failing.
Yeah, and the clock is ticking.
And the alternative isn't just like a dark age of history like the fall of Rome. It is a mutating, chaotic abyss that will physically warp your citizens into monsters. It's no wonder that the historical records show the rulers of this era reaching for incredibly desperate, untested solutions.
Desperation breeds terrible mistakes.
Right. Let's look at one of Gwyn's peers, the Witch of Izalith. She held one of the original Lord Souls alongside Gwyn, a soul focused on life and fire. And as the first flames started to die, she thought, I can fix this. I can synthetically recreate the first flame using my own power.
And it was a monumental, catastrophic disaster.
It really was.
It serves as a profound historical example of a leader reaching for a technological or magical solution that completely ignores the natural limits and safety valves of the world. By trying to artificially manufacture a fundamental force of nature, she created something entirely different. The chaos flame.
Let's talk about the mechanics of why that failed, because I think it's vital. The first flame was a steady combustion. It provided warmth and light. But the chaos flame was uncontrolled. I equate it to a nuclear meltdown. She tried to build a reactor without understanding how to insert the control rods, and it just went critical.
That is a highly accurate comparison. The chaos flame did not sustain the world. It warped it instantly.
The radiation just leaked everywhere.
Exactly. The uncontrollable energy consumed her entire underground kingdom of Izalith. It mutated her and her daughters into horrific, agonizing forms. And most significantly, the radiation of the Chaos Flame spontaneously generated an entirely new, hostile ecosystem.
The demons.
Yes, the entire species of demons. In her attempt to save life, she birthed the chaotic mutation of it.
It was an absolute catastrophe. And seeing that failure, seeing that you cannot synthetically manufacture the flame, Gwyn realizes he is completely out of options. He cannot build a new fire. So he is left with only one ultimate horrific choice. He gathers his most loyal, elite soldiers, the Black Knights. They leave the grand city of Anor Londo, and they travel back to the origin point of the world, the kiln of the first flame. And Gwyn commits the ultimate sacrifice.
It's a terrifying moment in the history.
He steps into the fading embers, and he uses his own physical body and his own divine soul as literal kindling to reignite the fire.
And the physical toll of this act is just astonishing to consider, even in a world of magic and gods.
Right.
The first flame is the most powerful energetic force in existence.
Mm-hmm.
By offering himself as fuel, Gwyn burned alive for a millennia.
1,000 years of burning.
Yes. The historical texts note that the sheer explosive heat of that initial rekindling instantly incinerated his loyal Black Knights who stood guard.
It just vaporized them.
It didn't just kill them, it reduced them to disembodied spirits. Their consciousness was permanently fused and trapped within their charred armor.
That's horrifying.
They were doomed to wander the world as ghosts of a bygone era, forever guarding a kingdom that no longer truly existed.
It is a staggering image. The Lord of Sunlight, the most powerful being in history, reduced to a burnt-out, mindless husk, enduring unimaginable agony just to keep the lights on for a little bit longer.
Yes.
And the tragedy is that it worked. He restarted the clock. But by doing this, by artificially extending the Age of Fire past its natural expiration date, he committed what the later historical records refer to as the first sin.
This is arguably the most pivotal moment in the entire timeline. Because Gwyn didn't just throw himself on the fire. He had to ensure that the dark could not rise and overthrow his prolonged age while he was incapacitated.
Right, he had to secure his investment.
Exactly. Humanity, you see, was born of the dark soul. They were intrinsically tied to that prima materia. So to prevent humanity from ushering in the Age of Dark, Gwyn placed a seal, a literal ring of fire, around humanity's dark soul to keep it contained.
He quarantined them.
He was trying to quarantine the dark. He was attempting to hold back entropy through sheer, stubborn force of will.
But the unintended consequence of that quarantine was apocalyptic. This ring of fire created the undead curse. It created what is known as the dark sign. By placing a seal of fire on a creature of dark, Gwyn fundamentally severed humanity from the natural cycle of life and death.
Right. Okay, wait. I have to pause here.
Sure.
Because this is the core moral dilemma of this entire history, and I want to know where you stand.
Okay, lay it on me.
If you are a leader and you know your world is ending, and the alternative is your people mutating into abyssal monsters,
Yeah.
isn't it your absolute fundamental duty to try and save it? Even if the methods are extreme.
It's a tough call.
I mean, Gwyn sacrificed himself. He didn't just order others to die. He burned for 1,000 years. What would you do if your civilization was facing total darkness? Can we really condemn him for trying to save the world?
It is the ultimate question of leadership in an existential crisis. Does the mandate to protect your civilization justify breaking the fundamental laws of nature?
Look, Gwyn's sacrifice is undeniably selfless on a personal level. He gave everything. But the geopolitical reality is that Gwyn chose to preserve his civilization's architecture at the cost of its inhabitants' souls.
That's a good way to put it.
He saved the illusion of light, he maintained the physical structures of Anor Londo, but he cursed the very people he governed to an eternity of unimaginable suffering. He treated a natural, necessary transition, the changing of an age, like a disease that had to be cured.
And that cure, that artificial eternity, completely warped the trajectory of the world. Because Gwyn's sacrifice wasn't just a one-time historical event, it created a template.
A very dangerous template.
Right, the fire would inevitably fade again. And when it did, someone else would have to sacrifice themselves. It became a systemic requirement for the world's survival.
And to understand the crushing psychological weight of this curse on the general populace, we can look at the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche's concept of eternal recurrence.
Ah, Nietzsche.
Right. Nietzsche posed a famous thought experiment. What if a demon approached you and told you that you had to live your exact life? with all its trivialities, its deep pains, and its fleeting joys, over and over again for eternity.
That sounds exhausting.
How would that realization change your actions? Would it crush you or would it liberate you?
But for humanity in this historical framework, it is not a philosophical thought experiment to debate over dinner. It is a literal, inescapable physical reality. The dark sign brands their flesh.
Yes.
When they are killed, whether by a monster, starvation, or a blade, they do not find the peace of death. They are forcibly resurrected at a bonfire, their bodies slightly more decayed, their minds slightly more fractured, and they must push forward again.
It's a terrifying existence.
It is endless, brutal death and rebirth. And this compounding physical and mental trauma leads to a terrifying psychological breakdown known as hollowing.
Right. Hollowing is a brilliant, horrifying realization of Nietzsche's concept, stripped of all its philosophical romance and rendered as sheer agony.
It's the worst-case scenario.
When a human loses their sense of purpose, when the pain of endless resurrection outweighs their drive to continue, their mind shatters. They literally lose their identities, their memories, and their humanity.
They just empty out.
Exactly. They become mindless, violent husks. The humans are trapped in a decaying world, unable to exit the stage, slowly going mad.
So let's look at this through a strictly utilitarian lens. Utilitarianism argues that the most ethical choice is the one that produces the greatest good or the least amount of suffering for the greatest number of people.
Okay.
Was linking the fire actually the most ethical choice? If the age of dark, the unchecked abyss, means humanity mutating into literal mindless monsters, doesn't extending the age of fire, despite the horror of the undead curse, still provide the greatest good?
It's a highly compelling argument. Is existence as a cursed, immortal wanderer who might eventually lose their mind better than immediate existence as a mutated, chaotic beast of the abyss?
Right. Think of it like this. Imagine a massive, towering skyscraper that houses millions of people.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
But the foundation is fundamentally flawed, and the building is slowly starting to collapse. The engineers realize they can't fix the foundation, so instead they start using duct tape, scaffolding, and literally draining the blood of the residents to create a paste to hold the walls up.
That is a dark image.
The residents are in constant agony, the building is swaying, and chunks of plaster are falling on them daily. It is a miserable, painful existence. But is it better than the terrifying, unknown alternative of simply letting the skyscraper collapse and hoping some people survive the rubble?
That architectural analogy captures the bleakness of the situation perfectly.
Yeah.
You are maintaining the structure, but the quality of life within the structure is entirely compromised.
Yeah.
And what deeply complicates this ethical equation is the issue of consent. The people trapped in that swaying skyscraper of the human race are not the ones who made the decision to use their blood as mortar. That decision was made unilaterally by the gods.
And to keep that horrific system running, the gods had to manufacture consent. Because you can't just tell an entire population, hey, we need you to suffer endlessly and eventually burn alive to keep our cities looking nice.
No, that wouldn't go over well.
The historical record reveals a massive, centuries-long campaign of propaganda. Gwyn's remaining children, operating alongside a primordial serpent named Frampt, established a dominant global religion known as the Way of White.
And the Way of White is a masterclass in societal manipulation and state-sponsored religion.
It really is.
They took the horrific tragedy of the undead curse, a curse inflicted upon humanity by the gods themselves, and they repackaged it as a holy divine prophecy.
It's unbelievable when you map it out.
It is deeply cynical. They convinced humanity that their suffering had a grand, noble purpose. The Way of White taught that an undead champion was destined to rise, gather powerful souls, and eventually succeed Lord Gwyn by traveling to the kiln and sacrificing themselves to link the fire once again.
They turned the victim into the willing martyr.
Precisely.
They manipulated the very people they cursed. They convinced humans that it was their sacred duty to voluntarily act as literal firewood for a world order that actively oppressed them. They convinced the battery to be grateful it was being drained.
But as with any oppressive regime, we must also look at the historical counter-movements. The hegemony of the Way of White was not absolute.
Right, there's always a resistance.
Exactly. Opposed to Frampt is another primordial serpent, Caith, who guides a secretive organization known as the Sable Church. Caithford preaches a completely different, radically subversive doctrine. He argues that the undead curse is not a holy mixtion, but a symptom of Gwyn's unnatural intervention.
Caith tells humans the forbidden truth. He tells them that the gods are actually terrified of them.
Yes.
He preaches that hollows, those who have lost their minds to the curse, are actually the most honest, unfiltered expression of mankind, freed from the illusions of the gods. He advocates for a human champion not to link the flame, but to usurp it entirely, to steal its remaining power, extinguish the fire, and bring about the age of man bathed in dark.
This, however, raises a vital historical and philosophical question.
Which is?
Is Caith genuinely a revolutionary looking out for humanity's best interests? Or is he simply another opportunistic power broker trying to install a new regime with himself pulling the strings?
Ah, right.
Because if you usurp the flame, you become the Lord of Hollows. But an age of dark, ruled by a singular, all-powerful human leading an army of mindless hollows, might just be trading one tyrant for another.
So the cure might be just as bad as the disease.
Exactly. The historical sources are remarkably ambiguous, perhaps intentionally so, about whether the Age of Dark is actually a paradise of human liberation or just a different, more chaotic flavor of ruin.
It is incredibly murky history. We are relying on texts written by manipulative serpents and fading gods, but what is absolutely clear mathematically and historically is that a system built on a flawed foundation, built on a lie, and sustained by constant human sacrifice cannot last forever.
No, it cannot.
The duct tape on the skyscraper eventually gives out. It will inevitably collapse under its own weight. And when we trace the historical timeline of the kingdoms that tried to follow Gwyn's template, we see a horrific, cascading failure.
The pattern is undeniable and deeply tragic. The repeated attempts to maintain the Age of Fire resulted in increasingly desperate, morally bankrupt acts of preservation by successive rulers.
Like what happened to New Lundo.
Exactly. We mentioned the city of New Lundo earlier, the human city allied with Gwyn. When the abyss finally began to seep into New Lundo, corrupting its leaders and citizens into dark creatures, the response from the ruling gods was very telling.
They didn't mount a rescue mission. They didn't send in healers or scientists to try and cure the corruption.
No, not at all. They made a cold, utilitarian calculation. They flooded the entire city.
Just wiped it off the map.
They enlisted specialized sorcerers to break the dams, sealing the massive iron gates, and letting the water rush in, completely entombing the population. They drowned thousands of their own subjects, men, women, and children, to contain the spread of the abyss. It was containment through absolute indiscriminate destruction. The preservation of the wider world justified the mass eradication of a localized threat.
And then if you look at the capital city itself, Anor Londo, when the historical actor, the undead champion, finally reaches the city of the gods in the timeline, it is breathtaking. It looks bathed in glorious, warm sunlight. Giant sentinels guard the halls.
So it's perfect.
But if you dig deeper, you realize it is a complete facade. The gods had long since fled the fading fire. They abandoned their post.
They left humanity holding the bag.
Yeah. The sunlight, the towering guards, even the ruling Princess Guinevere sitting in the cathedral. It was all a literal magical illusion cast by Gwyn's youngest marginalized child, Gwyndolin.
It is a profound, almost heartbreaking metaphor for the entire Age of Fire at that point in history.
Yeah.
A grand, beautiful, golden illusion masking an empty, abandoned reality.
It's all smoke and mirror.
The ruling class was projecting strength and divine right, while completely hollow and terrified on the inside.
And as history marches on, the weight of this cycle of constantly sacrificing champions to keep the illusion going becomes heavier and heavier. Successive kingdoms rise and fall, each trying to manage the fading flame and the escalating undead curse.
Right.
You have King Vendrick of the Kingdom of Drangleic. He is a fascinating figure because he realized the cycle was a trap. He tried to find a third option, to cure the curse without linking the fire.
But he failed.
He failed entirely. He built his massive kingdom directly on top of the ruins of older kingdoms, repeating the exact same mistakes of militarism and hubris, and he ultimately succumbed to the curse himself. He ended his days as a mindless hollow, dragging his giant sword in circles in a dark, forgotten crypt.
And the tragedy of this forced cycle reaches its absolute structural zenith with the final kingdom in the timeline, Lothric.
Oh,
Lothric was not just a society, it was a factory. The entire political, religious, and scholarly infrastructure was bred for one single horrific purpose, to produce an heir strong enough to act as the ultimate kindling.
They were engineering firewood.
Yes. They engaged in dark, unspeakable rituals, obsessive bloodline management, and twisted magical experimentation just to engineer the perfect sacrifice.
But when that perfect sacrifice, Prince Lothric, was finally born, he was frail and sickly. And more importantly, He was educated.
Knowledge is dangerous to that kind of system.
It really is. He looked at the cycle, he looked at the thousands of years of human ash, and he simply refused to participate. He locked himself in the highest tower of his castle and decided to just let the fire die. He went on strike.
A literal existential strike.
And because the entire state apparatus was built on the fundamental assumption of his eventual sacrifice, his refusal caused the entire kingdom to instantly collapse into violent civil war and ruin.
By the time we reach the very end of the timeline, the era of the Ashen Ones, where Lautrec resides, the consequences of repeatedly artificially extending the world's lifespan have transcended politics and society.
Fair.
The damage has become geographical.
Yeah, the world is physically, structurally breaking down.
Yes.
And here's where it gets really interesting. Because when you read the accounts of this final era, the Dreg Heap, it sounds like a surrealist nightmare. The lands are literally converging.
They're crashing into each other.
Exactly. Different continents, different timelines, entirely different historical eras are being physically pulled into a tangled, ruined mass at the base of the dying flame. Gravity is warping. Giant cathedrals are jutting out of the earth at impossible 90-degree angles. Space and time are failing.
It is the ultimate catastrophic manifestation of entropy. By refusing to let the system reset naturally, by forcing the cosmic machine to keep running on empty for thousands of years, they haven't just damaged the societies that live on the world, they have broken the underlying physics of reality itself.
They pushed the engine too far.
Way too far. The fabric of the universe is tearing apart because it was not designed to be stretched this far.
And that, to me, is the real tragedy of this entire historical study. The tragedy isn't that the world is ending. Worlds end. Empires fall. The sun will eventually burn out.
It's natural.
The tragedy is that the world's rulers refuse to let it end. They treat a natural transition, the turning of the cosmic page, like a perpetual emergency that must be fought at all costs, no matter how many millions of people suffer in the process.
Which brings us to a crucial shift in our analysis. We have examined the macro-level collapse of empires, the grand political machinations, and the physics of the world.
Right.
But how does an individual, a single historical actor, navigate a world that is fundamentally broken, utterly indifferent to their suffering, and built on a lie?
So we're moving from the physics of the universe into the realm of existentialism. How do you find meaning in a meaningless, endless loop of suffering?
Right. To understand the psychology of the undead, we can apply the 20th century philosopher Martin Heidegger's concept of thrownness. Yes, thrownness. In Heidegger's view, human beings do not choose the conditions of their existence. We are thrown into the world, into a specific historical context, a specific culture, with no clear inherent purpose and vastly incomplete information about how the world actually works.
I like to think of Heidegger's thrownness like waking up in the passenger seat of a car going 90 miles an hour toward a cliff in the pitch dark.
That's a very visceral way to put it.
You didn't start the car, you don't know who is driving, and you don't know where you are. But you are the one who has to grab the steering wheel and figure it out before you crash. That is the exact psychological state of a hollow waking up in the undead asylum.
That is a perfect encapsulation. They wake up cursed, locked in a cell, given a vague, manipulative prophecy by a dying knight, and are pushed out into a hostile, dying world.
Just total confusion.
They don't know about the grand political machinations of Frampt or Caith. They don't understand the thermodynamics of the first flame. They're just thrown into the meat grinder and told to survive.
And as they push through this world, facing insurmountable odds, fighting monsters 10 times their size, and dying over and over again, their struggle evokes another major philosophical work. Albert Camus's essay, The Myth of Sisyphus.
Yes, he can.
Sisyphus, in Greek mythology, was condemned by the gods to push a massive boulder up a steep hill, only to watch it roll back down to the bottom for all eternity.
Right, and Camus used Sisyphus as a metaphor for the human condition. He argued that the universe is fundamentally absurd and meaningless.
And trying to find meaning is the struggle.
Exactly. Seeking inherent meaning in a universe that offers none is like pushing that boulder. The undead pushing through the ruins of Lordran, fighting massive demons, dying, losing their progress, and waking up at the bonfire to do it all again. That is the literal embodiment of Sisyphus pushing the boulder.
But Camus didn't say we should just give up. He famously concluded that we must imagine Sisyphus happy. He argued that the struggle itself toward the heights is enough to fill a man's heart. We must find our own meaning, our own personal defiance, in the act of rebellion against the absurd.
However, in the history of Dark Souls, there is a terrible, highly common alternative to that defiant rebellion, and we touched on it earlier. Hollowing.
Right.
When an undead loses their purpose, when they look at the boulder and simply refuse to push it anymore, they go hollow. They become mindless.
They just break.
Hollowing is the literal physical equivalent of a person succumbing to the absurdity rather than fighting it. It is existential surrender.
So, to avoid hollowing, to maintain their sanity, the historical actor must push forward to the very bitter end. They must reach the kiln of the first flame and confront the architect of this entire miserable cycle, Gwyn himself.
And the historical record of this final confrontation is astonishing because it completely subverts expectations. You have spent the entire timeline hearing about the Lord of Sunlight, the god who shattered the immortal dragons.
Right, you expect a grand cinematic clash with the deity at the height of his power.
But that's not what happens at all. There is no grand introduction, no booming monologue. You step through the fog into an arena made entirely of gray ash, and a burnt, exhausted old man immediately sprints at you.
It is an incredibly melancholy confrontation.
It really is.
And the music. The historical accounts specifically note the auditory experience of this duel. It isn't some grand orchestral boom with chanting choirs, which was typical for major battles of the era. It's this incredibly sad, stripped-down piano melody.
It sets the mood perfectly.
And here's the brilliant detail. The theme is played almost entirely on the white keys of the piano. It lacks the complex disparity of the black keys. It is musically portraying a world that has lost its complexity, a world that is completely out of gas. It mirrors the fading of the fire perfectly.
The historical lore is even reflected in the documented combat mechanics of the era.
Great.
Gwyn is relentlessly aggressive, swinging his flaming sword wildly, giving the combatant no room to breathe.
Just lashing out in a panic.
But, uniquely among the great lords of this history, he possesses a fatal vulnerability. He can be easily defeated by a specific simple technique, parrying, deflecting his blow with his shield and riposting with a critical strike.
I love this detail so much, because it's not just a combat tactic, it's a thematic statement. The fact that the legendary Lord of Sunlight can be swatted aside like a common foot soldier highlights his tragic, weakened state.
It diminishes his godly status entirely.
He isn't a god calculating his strikes anymore. He's a desperate, fading man reduced to predictable panic swings. It makes defeating him feel less like a heroic triumph and much more like a necessary mercy killing.
Once Gwyn is finally defeated and his suffering is ended, the historical actor is left standing alone in the ash with the ultimate existential choice. The flame is at their feet. How do you resolve thousands of years of broken history?
Well, as we discussed, Prince Lothric represented an absurdist rebellion. He just sat back and watched the world burn, refusing to participate. But that just prolongs the stagnation. The world continues to rot while he watches.
The ultimate, most profound resolution lies in another concept from Nietzsche. The Übermensch, or the Overman.
The Overman.
The Übermensch is an individual who realizes that the old gods are dead and the old moralities are hollow. Instead of falling into despair, they create their own values. They reject the dogmas of the past, and they overcome the limitations of their era to forge a new path for humanity.
So the historical actor has the option to reject both of the manipulative paths laid out for them. They can reject the way of White's lie of linking the fire and continuing the cycle of sacrifice.
Yes.
And they can also reject the Sable Church's shadowy, potentially tyrannical age of dark under Cathy's control. They can walk away and forge a third path.
This struggle to find a third path is best illustrated by the final historical figure encountered in the very last days of the timeline. Slave Knight Gale.
Gale is such a tragic figure.
He really is. Gale is encountered at the literal end of time, in a vast, endless wasteland of ash where all kingdoms have finally crumbled to dust. Gale has spent centuries hunting down the fragments of the original Dark Soul, driven by a desperate, agonizing hope.
What was he hoping for?
He wants to use the blood of the Dark Soul as pigment for a magical painter so she can paint a new, gentle world for humanity to escape into.
See, Gale is such a tragic figure because he represents the dangerous, false virtues of pity and hope. He pities the broken world and he hopes for an external salvation, a magical new painting to run away to.
Right.
But relying on that false hope is a rejection of the reality of the world they're actually in. It is just another form of escapism, no different than the Witch of Izalith trying to synthetically recreate the fire thousands of years earlier. Both of them are desperately trying to engineer a way out of natural consequences.
Exactly. Defeating Gale at the end of time is the final, ultimate test for the historical actor. By striking down Gale, they are striking down the embodiment of false hope.
They are accepting reality.
They achieve the ultimate overcoming of the self. They strip away the very last illusions of the old world. They accept that there is no magical painting, no divine prophecy, and no easy way out.
Wow.
By doing this, they become the true Übermensch. They end the cycle of the gods entirely, ready to face whatever comes next, even if it is total darkness on their own terms.
So what does this all mean? We have spent this time looking at centuries of a fictional history, but the mechanics, the psychology, and the lessons are profoundly real.
They absolutely apply to the real world.
Gwyn's story is a stark historical lesson on the extreme dangers of resisting natural change. It shows us how the desperate desire to hold on to a golden age, to freeze time, can corrupt the very foundation of a society and lead to unimaginable suffering.
It forces us to examine the ethics of leadership in a crisis. When does the mandate to protect your people cross the line into oppressing them? And on a deeply personal level, this history beautifully illustrates the existential burden of finding our own meaning and purpose when all the grand prophecies, societal structures, and religious dogmas are revealed as hollow lies.
It is an absolute masterpiece of dark historical philosophy.
I will leave you with a final thought to ponder. If we strip away the magic, the dragons, and the knights, the core question at the heart of this history remains intensely relevant to our daily lives.
Let's hear it.
In your own life, how often do you endure immense, unnecessary suffering just to maintain a flame? Perhaps a miserable job, a toxic relationship, or an outdated belief system that was naturally meant to fade long ago?
Man, that's heavy.
What would happen if you finally found the courage to stop sacrificing yourself to keep it lit? What would happen if you let the fire die and step boldly into the dark?
Wow, that is definitely something to sit with. Well, thank you so much for joining us on this incredible deep dive into the history of the First Flame. As always, you are a fellow learner on this journey, and we appreciate you exploring these murky philosophical waters with us.
It was a pleasure to dissect it all.
Remember, that X-ray machine of history is often broken, and the past is rarely as clean or as noble as the victors want it to be. Until next time, keep questioning the world around you.